There's a moment in history that feels almost fictional, a moment so strange, so utterly bizarre that even historians struggle to explain what actually happened. And I'm not talking about war, famine, or plague, though those were certainly part of it. I'm talking about something far stranger. Something that made entire nations stop, stare at the sky, and genuinely believe that God was speaking to them directly. That the end times had arrived, that the world as they knew it was about to be swallowed by darkness. This is the story of 1816, the year that wasn't, the year when summer never came. Picture this. It's May 1816 in New England. People wake up, look outside, and something feels wrong. The air carries a sharp bite that shouldn't be there. Snow begins to fall, not the gentle expected snow of April or early May, but thick, blinding flakes that cover fields, crops, and the fragile green shoots that farmers had just planted days before. By June, frost still hangs in the mornings, crops die in the fields, cattle perish from cold, and nobody, absolutely nobody, has any idea why. But here's where it gets stranger. This wasn't isolated to New England. Across the Atlantic, Europe was experiencing the exact same nightmare. In Switzerland, it was so cold that farms couldn't support livestock. Families who survived wars and hardship suddenly faced something they couldn't fight with, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't understand. In France, bread prices skyrocketed. In Ireland, potato crops failed, a preview of the horror that would come decades later. Entire villages ran out of food. People were starving not because of war, but because the sky itself had betrayed them.
The fear spread like wildfire. If you were alive in 1816, you didn't have meteorologists or weather satellites. You didn't have science to explain what was happening. What you had was your faith, your fear, and your certainty that you were being punished. Preachers across Europe stood in pulpits and declared with absolute conviction that the apocalypse was upon us. The book of Revelation come to life. God was angry. The world was ending. This was it. And the terrifying part? A significant portion of Europe actually believed them. But before we dive deeper into the panic, the suffering, and the strange theories that emerged from the darkness, we need to go back further. We need to find the actual source of this catastrophe. Because 1816 wasn't an act of God, it was the consequence of something that had happened months earlier on the other side of the world, in a place most Europeans had never heard of and couldn't find on a map. On April 10, 1815, in the Dutch East Indies, what we now call Indonesia, a mountain called Mount Tambora didn't just erupt. It exploded with such force that the sound was heard nearly 2,000 miles away. The explosion was so massive that it remains one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. But here's the crucial detail that nobody understood at the time. Tambora didn't just destroy the region around it. It sent millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere. So high that it began to circle the Earth, creating a veil of particles that blocked out the sun. The people of Europe had no way of knowing this. They couldn't see the invisible veil. They couldn't trace the cause. All they knew was that the seasons had stopped making sense, that summer had been canceled, that God, or something equally powerful, was speaking to them in the language of cold and hunger. What happened next wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of how fear reshapes civilization, how the human mind creates meaning from chaos, how one volcanic eruption on an island that most people couldn't locate, combined with incomplete information and absolute terror, nearly broke a continent.
And it all started because of a decision made years earlier. One that would ultimately point the finger at the very science that could have explained what was happening. Science that the people of 1816 didn't trust. Science that seemed too strange, too new, too impossible to believe.
This is the year that rewrote how humans understood their relationship with nature, the year that proved we weren't in control, the year that revealed how thin the line between civilization and catastrophe truly is, and the year that the entire continent of Europe learned what it felt like to stare into an abyss that had no name, no face, and no explanation. The strangest part? We almost forgot this happened. History glossed over it, moved on. But the consequences of 1816 would echo forward for decades. They would reshape societies. They would change beliefs. They would inspire art, literature, and some of the darkest works of imagination that the 19th century would ever produce. And it all began because the sky went dark.
So what exactly happened during those endless frozen months? How did entire nations come to the edge of collapse? What did people do when they realized that faith, prayer, and hope couldn't bring back the warmth? And what does this strange, almost forgotten catastrophe tell us about how fragile our world truly is? When the sun doesn't come back, the mind breaks before the body does. This is the truth that emerged as 1816 stretched on. The frosts didn't ease. Summer came, but it came wrong. Temperatures remained so cold that even when the sun appeared, its warmth couldn't penetrate the veil of ash hanging in the upper atmosphere. Crops that had been replanted after the May snow died again in June, then again in July. By August, farmers were harvesting nothing. Their fields were graveyards of withered plants and broken dreams.
Imagine being a farmer in 1816. You've survived previous bad years. You understand that nature can be cruel. But this was different. This wasn't a local drought or a regional frost. This was global. This was a shifting of the fundamental rules of existence, and you had no way to know that it would eventually end. For all you knew, the sun had abandoned the earth permanently. The hunger began quietly, a tightening in the belly, a child's ribs becoming visible beneath thin skin, mothers rationing the last of their stores, knowing it wouldn't be enough to last until the next harvest, if there was a next harvest. Governments, panicked and confused, began instituting price controls and rationing systems that only made things worse. When supply disappears, artificial price caps don't save people. They just create black markets and desperation. But starvation wasn't the only crisis. Crime exploded. In cities across Europe, desperate people turned to theft, robbery, and violence. The social fabric that held communities together started tearing apart under the weight of collective desperation. And then something shifted. The fear became so absolute, so all-consuming that it transformed into something darker and stranger. It transformed into collective delusion. In France, rumors began spreading that if you burned forests, you could change the weather. That if you created enough smoke, you could block out the ash that was blocking out the sun. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but remember, in 1816, there was no official explanation for what was happening. Science hadn't yet traced the disaster back to Mount Tambora. All people had was confusion and the desperate need to believe that they could do something, anything, to fix it. So thousands of people took to the forests and burned them deliberately. They weren't stupid, they were terrified, and they were looking for any theory that offered hope. In other parts of Europe, the reaction was more sinister. People began looking for someone to blame, someone to punish. In some villages, they turned on the poor, the elderly, the marginalized, anyone who could be cast as responsible for the wrath they believed was falling upon them. The wheels of superstition and scapegoating began to turn. If God was angry, someone must have provoked him. Who better to blame than the vulnerable, the powerless, the easy targets? Religious movements exploded. New sects emerged with claims that they alone understood the will of God, that they alone could interpret what was happening. Some groups became so convinced that the end times had arrived that they made apocalyptic preparations. They gave away their possessions. They gathered on hilltops to wait for a rapture. They redoubled their prayers, their sacrifices, their devotions, all while the world got colder and harvests continued to fail. But here's what makes this story so profound, and here's what gets lost when history becomes a simple list of facts. Amidst all this darkness, there was also something unexpected, something almost miraculous. There were also acts of extraordinary kindness. Communities banded together. Wealthier families, understanding that the crisis was universal, began sharing their stores with neighbors. Churches and monasteries opened their granaries to the hungry. Local governments, though overwhelmed and confused, tried desperately to create soup kitchens and distribution systems. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something, and it revealed that humans don't always crumble into chaos when the world turns dark. Sometimes we reach toward each other instead. By late 1816 and into 1817, the worst began to pass. The ash veil slowly, gradually began to dissipate. Sunlight returned. The seasons started to normalize. The temperatures climbed back to something approaching normal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the hunger began to ease. Crops grew again. Animals could be raised again. The world remembered how to sustain itself, but the trauma lasted far longer than the crisis itself. The year without a summer had created psychological scars that wouldn't heal for decades. Entire generations carried the memory of that time, and it changed them. It changed how they understood their place in the world. It shattered the illusion of safety and predictability. And then something remarkable happened. Some of the greatest minds of that era began to process their fear through art and imagination. Mary Shelley, who was 20 years old in 1816, spent that summer traveling through Europe with her family. She witnessed the cold, the strange darkness at noon, the fear that gripped nations. That summer, sheltering indoors during the unnatural weather, she began writing a story about a scientist who dared to create life. A story born directly from the trauma of witnessing the natural world betray humanity. That story became Frankenstein, one of the most enduring works of dark fiction ever written. The novel emerged from 1816. It was born from fear. And that's perhaps the most important lesson this strange year teaches us. Sometimes our darkest moments become the birthplace of our greatest creations. Sometimes when the world becomes too scary to face directly, we transform that fear into stories, art, and imagination. We process the unbearable by creating worlds that reflect it back to us in ways we can understand. Tambora's eruption killed around 70,000 people directly, but the global consequences, the famine, the disease, the instability, those numbers are impossible to calculate. Historians estimate that the crisis of 1816 and 1817 may have displaced millions of people and contributed to deaths far exceeding the initial explosion. And for what? For a mountain in a place nobody thought mattered, for ash in the atmosphere that nobody could see or touch or fight against. The year without a summer taught the world a lesson that we still struggle to accept today. We are not in control. Nature doesn't answer to our prayers or our laws or our hopes. It operates on its own timeline, by its own rules. And we are passengers on a planet that at any moment can remind us of just how small we truly are. That's what made 1816 so strange. Not the cold, not the hunger, but the collision between human certainty and natural chaos, between our need to believe we understand the world and the absolute proof that we don't, between our desire for order and the indifference of the cosmos. And that's a truth worth remembering, because the world is always one volcanic eruption away from darkness, one invisible veil away from chaos, 1 year away from wondering if summer will ever come again.